So we're going to start our conversation with our rhetorical triangle. We're going to go all the way back to the beginning. A lot of times when we think about the rhetorical triangle and the rhetorical framework, and some of these pieces like that, there's this misconception that it has to be grounded in nonfiction or argumentation. And a lot of times when teachers look at this language course, they always go, well, we don't have time for fiction. We're not going to do anything. No books, no novels, no short stories, none of it, because it's not rhetoric. Kind of is. And usually where that contingent gets caught up is here. Somebody give me a quick and dirty definition. What do we mean when we talk about exigence?
What's driving?
Yeah, it's that drive or that push from what is it that's inspiring them to step forward? Now that's different than purpose, because we said all year purpose is was like, all right, let me pull some examples of fiction that we can maybe like look at. Guy released this book a couple of years ago. It was a TV show last year, a couple of years ago, something like that. The book's about a vampire apocalypse that the government started. Yeah, just process that one. Like, what? They're like psychic vampires that end up taking over the world, and there's a huge time jump, like a third of the way into the book. Like, it goes like thousands of years into the future, into this like dystopic world of vampires. Is there probably an exigence for this? I sure hope not. I hope he didn't get into this government lab and see this and be like, I'm going to write this book. And everybody's like, wow, this is a great work of fiction. And he's like, it's not fiction. Oh, no. You look at a book like this. Notice both of them are huge, giant books. Now that I have them in my hands, I'm like, oh my gosh. Susanna Clarke, British writer, wrote this story about these two magicians, literally, who are like fighting in the 19th century. So it's like an adult Harry Potter, and it's written in this really exaggerated style. Please don't pick this up thinking, oh my gosh, it's like Harry Potter. No, it's not. It's really boring. Like, it's really like, stylistically, it's beautifully written. But there were points in the middle of this book that I was like, why am I still reading this? Like, oh my gosh. We'd like to think there are magicians, but you know what? There probably aren't. Mr. Walsh. Hey. Okay. Okay. I can get on it in just a moment. Yeah. All right. Thanks. All right. Anyway, sorry about that. When we look, exigence isn't always a definite thing with fiction, but there are examples where we can look at books and we can go, okay, we can kind of see what pushed the creation. Lincoln and the Bardo came out a few years ago. It won the Man Booker Prize, which is an award given for like really well-written fiction. George Saunders was the writer. It's his first novel. The guy's an old man. He writes lots of articles and things like that. But years ago, he heard a story when he was visiting DC. Somebody pointed out a crypt on a hill and said, do you know that that crypt used to belong to Willie Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's young son who died at 11? And they said, years ago, and he actually found the news stories to corroborate this, it was widely reported that after the death of his son, Lincoln would go to this cemetery, go into the crypt, and literally hold the body of his dead son. Now, yes, it's kind of dark and twisted where you're like, that's what? But it's also this thing that to him, it was this image that he could not shake out of his head. This man who led a country through war, who did all these pieces, but was so bothered by the death of his son that this was the only way he could deal with it. And so he took that story and he molded it into this work of fiction that is really different in how he approaches it. Because it's sort of like Willie Lincoln's ghost talking to the other ghosts in the cemetery, and all the other ghosts being like, why does that guy come and visit you? That's weird. You look at books like, I won't belabor this, Cormac McCarthy, great American writer. He writes Blood Meridian in the 80s and does huge amounts of like historical research to write this book. He spends years of his life researching the Glanton Gang, which were a group of mercenaries hired by the United States government to patrol the Texas-Mexico border and pretty much impose law and order. And what they ended up doing was killing, raping, stealing, and just going hog wild under the authority of the US government. We can see where this comes from. In a similar way, we can see where a book like The Road comes from, a post-apocalyptic book about a man and his son traveling in this world. Cormac McCarthy was in his 60s when his first and only child was born. And so here we see this push. Now being a father, he's examining what is it like to be a parent in this world where there doesn't seem to be meaning anymore. So when we talk about exigence in fiction, yeah, it's not always there, but when it is, it can really help us to find the meaning in the work and examine things. Let's talk a little bit about The Lost Generation. You read the article, we saw the videos. Tell me some of the things that stood out to you.
They lost a lot of their motivation.
What caused that loss of motivation?
Millions of deaths during the war.
I'm going to spell that. That's all right. What else?
They focused on material wealth.
Anything to add?
I was gonna say.
Okay, that's all right. Anything else?
All that material wealth got kind of boring and had no meaning anymore.
They would realize the past, so trying to move forward. There's like a change in girls and kind of a shift in how they view like masculinity.
Anything else? So let's start to weave our pieces together a little bit. And, feel free to, if something else jumps out at you as we're talking, throw it in. Let's talk about it. Let's start with our using Krebs, our story from Soldier's Home, as a way to kind of approach this lost generation, because we need to start with World War I. Consider the fact that World War I was the first American war to take place offshore that we had no vested interest in. So when we watched the video about World War I history yesterday, they talked about the fact that, America wasn't like number one sign up. We stayed out of it for a long time until we basically couldn't anymore. There was no vested interest there. So consider that you're good old Krebs. You live in Oklahoma, which already sucks. But you decide to go to war, right? And all of a sudden you find yourself in Europe, the old country. This place where all of the buildings almost are older than your entire country. Where you get to see this old world beauty and be exposed to this culture that's totally different. It's the first time you've probably left home in your life. And you see all this beauty and all this great stuff contrasted with all of this horror. Casualty rates in some companies for U.S. Army soldiers was as high as 20%, 1 in 5. This works a lot better when we have a full class with more than 20 people, but still, look around this room. That's like taking 2 of you out of here, and you never get to come back. You see all of this stuff, right? And then where does Krebs go? Where does he, like physically, where is he in the story?
He's at home.
He's back home in Oklahoma. Is anything different? Consider the fact that you saw all this destruction and all this death. And when you come home, there's literally no change and no impact. Nothing has changed here. Everything that happened there didn't matter. Dang. Is your brain starting to go, oh my gosh, I think I understand him a little better for how he reacted that way? How do you rectify for yourself all those little pieces like that? And this is what caused so many of those soldiers that came. One thing that we don't have here, I'm going to call it expats. Most of those that came back and became part of this lost generation, one, realized that they couldn't fit into that old world anymore. They've seen too much. And not just in terms of they've seen too much death or violence or destruction, but they've seen too much of the rest of the world to be okay with that little town anymore and the way that life is. And so a lot of writers and parts of this generation left America for overseas. Fitzgerald, for example, spent large amounts of time in France, where he partied and wrote because he felt like it more reflected who he was. And lots of different writers and artists were a part of this community. And so we have that. We notice some of these other pieces. This loss of motivation is huge because for the first time in the 20th century, people finally have the chance to explore their sense of identity, who they are, how they fit into the world, and how the world defines them. No longer are you stuck in that small town. Now you have choices. No longer do you have to take up dad's business for the family farm. You can say no and actually explore what life should be like for you. And so when we look at this idea of identity, we have these guys that saw so much, and when they came back, they literally didn't know what to do. How is that reflected with our good buddy Krebs?
His parents kind of want him to do something like get like a life, like get a life for himself, but he's like, I don't like really want to do that right now.
Mm-hmm. What's he spending every day doing?
So it's like a coach.
Sits on the porch and he reads and he looks at the girls. That's it.
And he talked about not having energy to like want to quote someone. He said that if he could just have them, he would like it, but he doesn't want to like go through the process.
Yes. Now, there is a whole subplot that we totally didn't talk about in terms of what kinds of relationships Krebs was probably having when he was over in Europe during the war versus what that relationship would be like in America. Which, if you're going, huh? What? Think about the difference between soldiers and one-night stands when they're overseas versus what kind of relationship you're likely going to have with girls when you come back. And you might be going, oh. We've got this whole thing that's there with that. We want to take some time to transition here. I want you to kind of work together and talk a bit. We've read 2 chapters. You probably have read a little more of Gatsby. I want to give you some time to take up the book and start to go, okay, how do we see some of these ideas reflected in the book itself? And so this is where I want you to dive in. You can do this with a partner. You can do this on your own. It is totally up to you. Take a couple of minutes to look back at what we've read and see where can you find examples of this lost generation exigence pushing through and influencing the novel. We'll come back together to discuss. Go.
Is it still recording?
Yeah, but don't worry about it. Or just push it away if you want.
got a headache. Here. I don't want to be here. I'm going to, alright, I'm going to put them separately in the group chat. I didn't have this morning with a guy on this day.
Hey, it's Walsh. How are you? Are you guys meeting today for the PLC? Okay. Let me see what I can find. Brooke doesn't have a cell phone. And what's her Carolyn's also updated. I know, so I'm trying to see if we can get somebody to cover. So let me try outside of your PLC first. See what I can find. Thank you. All right, bye.
My favorite part about this is that guy doesn't even have read
has over 100,000 followers. She has over, she's like 20,000 Patreon members, and she's getting accepted to 16 words. But she's like, she's got over 20,000 people in there, over 100,000 followers. And somebody's listening. The reason I think the reason the universe made me an introvert is because they know me. They just know me if I have control, they'll start being like, so tired of stupid people. So tired of stupid people. 20,000. I don't have any coffee now. The nicest one, and I'm throwing it. Everyone's basically saying, the woman expose her because she works. Who? Artist. The who? Yeah. She's like tweets in the past. That's what people are doing. Their pieces, yeah. I'm gonna do this one before I start this story. Tell me your joke. It's private. Yeah. Go private. I'm so tired of being on right now. Literally, I've never met a person who. I don't know if you're supposed to say picture on this call. Some of the should hardly just use a picture of the better. Get a job that can form me. I don't know whether you're like, it's so hard because a couple of people still do not have their artwork. And so then you could keep doing this. Making hundreds of dollars just being slightly okay at art. And you're like, you're doing hundreds of dollars because you make specific job for the super good. Congratulations. They don't. I can't even believe it's so wrong. Huh?
Okay. start to bring it back together and see what we came up with.
High quality should be.
What are some of the things that you're seeing?
Definitely focus on material wealth.
So think about how material wealth becomes a huge part of this. Everyone in this book, outside of two characters, the Wilsons, come from a place of privilege and money. They all have it. And it's just a natural thing. You know, Fitzgerald spends so much time at the beginning of chapter 2 having to paint a picture of what the Valley of Ashes is, because it is the opposite of the rest of the world that the book presents us with. He has to make a point about their poverty because it is so starkly different from the rest. And so this point about material wealth, huge and giant, but we should also notice, kind of like what John brought up, that you're going to notice that even though they have all these things, there's a definite lack of meaning to it. If you've been reading and you're done with this section that's due tomorrow, you know exactly what I'm talking about. What else do you notice?
There's kind of like a loss of importance of relationships.
Can you speak up just a little bit?
There's like a loss of relationship, like a loss of importance for the relationship. It's more like just for the status of it, and less about people. Like it goes back to like when Daisy was talking about her child, and really not caring about the child itself. Just kind of talking about like the beautiful form and all that.
Yeah, so I would definitely agree with you. You notice that people might be coupled up and it's there, but there's the emotional piece of it seems to be gone. You know, even if you look at Tom and Myrtle don't seem to make sense. And we talked about this before break, because you're like, well, she's not attractive and she's not rich. Like, what's he doing with her? It doesn't make sense until she starts talking. And then you go, oh, you're just as close-minded as he is. Oh, you have some of those same tendencies. But we do see all they do is, you know, seemingly fight. Especially. So yeah, you'll notice that with the daughter, you know, we'll see her once next week, and she's like presented like a doll. Like she comes out and kind of performs, and then she goes back. That's it. What else do you notice?
I love the idealization of the past whenever he's talking about like the good night and how it was lost. Like I think it's like the enchantment that was lost or something that he actually got Daisy.
Yeah, so if you haven't finished chapter 5, you may not quite be where Haley is with her understanding of this, but for sure, there is a definite idea than someone being nostalgic. But it's something specific usually. They're beyond them. Yeah.
It almost feels like with the whole deal with the past and how like knowing those things and now I feel like they're rushed. So it's so hard to explain, but
No. I think I'm following you. I just want to make sure I'm not going to put ideas in that aren't correct. That's why I'm
like
following.
they're trying to live out their youth. It's like the past like doesn't this makes sense.
Yes. So if I can rephrase, and again, correct me if I'm totally going off your idea. To a generation that was so met with early death, they feel as though they need to experience life at a faster pace because they're so worried about the looming nature of death. You know,
Everything to meaningless relationships is where they, rush into wealth and it loses all meaning to get super wealthy.
and remember that the big thing with our wealth in the book is that outside of Gatsby, we will find out more concrete details as the book goes on. All of these other people are born into wealth. They have always experienced this world of privilege and experiences, so they really don't know any different. And so their spending is exorbitant, but it's just what they're used to. But I will definitely agree there. If you think back to times of, oddly enough, wearing masks and all sitting here, times of pandemic and disease, you might remember in ninth grade, you did Romeo and Juliet, right? Yes. So you probably talked about Shakespeare and the theater, right? Yes. And so during that time period, theaters were regularly closed because of outbreaks of disease. And so what we got was this movement in literature, to kind of follow up on your idea. Carpe diem. Is it a phrase you know? You've heard it. It's Latin. What's it mean? Seize the day. Close enough. You're on the. It's a spiritual cousin. Seize the day. Carpe diem. So during that, exactly. YOLO is our more modern thing. So 16th century poetry around Shakespeare's time embraced this idea of carpe diem and used it as a way to talk about, young love. Why should we wait? What if we die tomorrow? Let's do things now. Let's get out there. Let's live life. And so really, I'm totally going to go with you there. Even though we do see that listlessness from these characters, we do see on the other end of it characters that are willing to just embrace and go with it. Look at how Myrtle Wilson talks about how she meets Tom Buchanan. Did we get a chance to talk about that conversation that she has with Nick at the end of chapter 2? All right, let's do it. So if you have your book, flip it open and let's look at page 36. And hazy, Nick recounts this conversation he has with the top of the page. She says, "It was on the two little seats facing each other that are always the last ones left on the train. I was going up to New York to see my sister and spend the night. He had on a dress suit and patent leather shoes, and I couldn't keep my eyes off him. But every time he looked at me, I had to pretend to be looking at the advertisement over his head. When we came into the station, he was next to me, and his white shirt front pressed against my arm, and so I told him I'd have to call a policeman, but he knew I lied. I was so excited that when I got into a taxi with him, I didn't hardly know I wasn't getting into a subway train. All I kept thinking about over and over was, you can't live forever. You can't live forever." Now, there's a lot of things that connect to Myrtle's characterization here in this little speech. Notice that her problem with her husband, as she recounted it to those at the party, is that he had to borrow someone else's suit to get married in. And so he appeared to be a man of wealth and means, and once they got married and somebody came to collect the suit, she realized the truth of the situation. So notice what draws her into Tom Buchanan is his suit, his shoes, the way he's dressed. They literally meet on a train, and the train probably takes no more than an hour to get to New York, and suddenly she's willing to get into a taxi and go wherever with this guy. And you're like, okay. But it helps to support this idea of carpe diem. He is what I want. He is ultimately what I thought my husband was, that he wasn't. And so even though I know I'm doing the wrong thing, hey, you can't live forever. I got to take advantage of it. So for sure, we see that raised here. Some things I always take note of and discuss. In chapter 1, the West comes up 4 separate times to describe almost every character in the chapter. When a word comes up once, okay, it's going to probably catch your attention. Twice, all right, I get it. 4 times in one chapter, and then it comes up 4 additional times in the rest of the book. Fitzgerald wants you to see this idea of the lost generation as not being comfortable with where they are, as not knowing what their place in the world was, and so they were restless. He repeats the word time and again in that first chapter to help to establish this idea. I always look at the conversation that's on page 12. In the middle of this dinner party that they're having, Nick kind of talks about the pace of the evening. And he says, it's very different than the pace he's used to at social situations. He says, normally when you're hanging out with your friends, you're hastily moving from thing to thing. Think about how, when you actually could hang out with your friends and do things for a whole evening. My God, right? You would usually make plans that were daisy chained. Hey, we're all going to go to see this movie, but we want to eat before we go to the movie. Okay, where are we going to eat? How long does it take to eat there? What time do we need to show up there? Well, if we're going to get there at this time, what time do I need to come and pick you up at? Okay, if we're going to do that, what time is the movie going to start at? What time do we need to get to the movie theater? Oh, you want to see the previews? And I guess we have to get there a half hour before that. Oh, and then we have to leave right afterwards because of your curfew. We have to get you home by then. Notice how a lot of times when we hang out with people, we have that hurt. Really, we're more concerned about what comes next rather than what we're doing in the moment. And Nick says that this moment here that he's at dinner with Tom and Daisy and Jordan, it's the opposite. He writes a sentence that literally reads, they were here. To describe the fact that there are no presumptions of having to work in the next morning because they're rich. They don't have to work. There's no concern about what they're going to do next because it doesn't matter to them. This kind of embellishes and gives that sense of what this generation really was. They weren't concerned about any of the rest of it. They didn't feel like everything was planned or ready to go, and they didn't know what they were doing. Think about how Nick becomes a Bond salesman because he's like, I don't think I can do it. He doesn't have a desire. He's just there. We're going to use this tomorrow as we talk about chapters 3 through 5. Anybody have questions that came up in their reading that they're just like, I don't quite get this? Okay, tomorrow we'll start with the quiz. We will have as much of a conversation as we can, but I will tell you, I will be posting notes after tomorrow that go through all 3 chapters in depth. So you'll have that. If you'll pack up and get set,